Gremio's Gustavo Nunes is on his way to the Premier League in a rumoured fee of £10 million to Brentford, arguably one of the most exciting young wingers, hence why we're doing this special episode on him. Peter and I will dive into his player profile, provide a bit more information about where he's come from, how he's quote unquote burst onto the scene in the last few months, and why Brentford fans should be particularly excited about this move. But Peter, look, welcome back to the podcast, mate. How are you doing? Exciting move, this one, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, as always. And Gustavo Nunes to Brentford here. What was it? There we land. That's popular now instead of here we go. Uh, yeah, ironically, we did kind of, well, I wouldn't say predict it, but we did hint that at some point we wouldn't be surprised if a move like this materializes. And I was very happy when I saw it on Twitter when Fabrizio Romano just posted the news. I was surprised it was Brentford, really, but doesn't mean I'm not excited for it, in all honesty.
No, we'll touch into his fit with Brentford, but we'll just add a bit more context as to who he is, where he's come from. He's only into his first 6, 7 months of senior football. He really has burst onto the scene, to be as cheesy as possible. But he's had his opportunity here, and just to add more context around this move, Gremio have had all sorts of problems over the last 6 months. And if we start on the pitch, they were really successful and got to the Libertadores, qualified for the competition rather, over from the last season. And since Luis Suarez, Cristaldo, Everton, the front three have left, which is why players like Nunes have been given the opportunity. And he played in the Copinha at the start of the year. And for people or listeners who don't know what that is, it's an under-20 tournament for Brazilian football right at the start of the year, where lots of scouts, lots of eyes are trying to find the next best player, because this is where the likes of Esteval and Endrick have come from. And Nunes was very similar to those two players we've just named in terms of scored a couple of goals, really stood out. And with these key players moving across from Gremio, especially Luis Suarez and Cristaldo, this offered an opportunity for Gustavo Nunes to come into the senior side, and he's taken it with both hands, and he's been super impressive. Yes, you can look at his stats and potentially say, well, 7 goals and 4 assists in 40 appearances. But if you dive into the numbers a little bit more, as we like to do on this show, he only averaged 60 minutes in the Brasileiro so far this campaign and 30 minutes in the Libertadores. So those stats are a mile, maybe not look impressive on a Wikipedia page, but from the naked eye, he's been very, very impressive for Gremio this season. There's a little bit of context as to how he came about into the senior squad. And yes, it's only 6 to 8 months, but we're seeing South American players being snapped up quicker and quicker. And Nunes, as we spoke about on the podcast before, and as Peter said, is someone who we've highly rated, we've singled out as a move to Europe at some point. But this one was very quiet and under the radar, and we'll get into that Brentford fit a little bit later. But let's focus on his player profile. Pete, I'm going to come to you first. I just didn't want to keep talking, basically, but I'll come to you to talk about his player profile, because we focus predominantly on Wesley, and he's been the link out of South America for quite some time for being this direct winger. But we've flagged how Nunes' stats are far better than him. And he's not a show pony, is he? A lot of people think, well, he signed a Brazilian winger, he's going to be all the Samba style. But Nunes is far more direct. And I think that's what makes his profile really intriguing.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to quickly mention as well, I think at the start of the year, Gustavo Nunes actually didn't, for the people just so they know, that he didn't actually, he up until that point, he had just trained with the senior team, and it makes his jump all the more impressive because, as you rightfully mentioned, it was in the Copinha actually that he kind of left his mark a little bit more, and Gremio in need of fresh blood on the wings because they did sign Soteldo, and people likely don't know who Soteldo is, that, but he was one of the better players for relegated Santos last year. But he was expected to be actually the starting left wing. And actually, Nunes kind of over the time got his chance, and it makes it all the more impressive because this is his first senior season, and he's actually, I'd argue, he's the best player at Gremio currently, if I'm being completely honest, just because he provides all the spark, all the energy, all the offensive drive in the side that is usually kind of lackluster in a sense. And it's why I feel we've all been very heavy on him at the Copper Club, because he's just, his profile and way of play is one that you kind of love, because we'll dive into deep into it now. Is we mentioned Wesley, and Gustavo is in a similar sense. He's not really a show pony, as you mentioned. He's not someone that likes to nutmeg opponents, kind of dribble the ball past him numerous times or something. He's actually very direct. Like, he wants to beat the opponent and then make up the ground and kind of get into forward position really quickly. It, to me, the thing that kind of separates him a little bit from Wesley is that, compared to Wesley, who's a little bit more cut inside and shoot directly, like that's his bread and butter, Gustavo is actually one that can also drive to the byline. I think that's why sometimes when Renato Gaucho wants to switch things up, he actually moves him to the right wing for a little bit, just to impact. Like, he runs off to the byline, tries to cross it inside, a bit more old school style football. And I think in that sense, we can share a bit of a negative here, at least from what I've seen from him. And this is not too much of a knock, but he's very one-footed, actually. He relies too much on his right foot, if anything. And as a result, I'd suspect that's one thing then, and one area that he has to improve. It's not to say that when he relies on his dribble, he doesn't use his left foot. No, he does, but it's not as often as some players do. Like, say, well, obviously it's Neymar, but when you think of players who are ambipedal in a sense, you obviously think of the best, obviously the best of the best, like the cream of the crop, like Neymar, Ronaldinho, whatnot. And Gustavo is anything but. Like, if anything, all of his dribbles are right-footed. Like 99% of the time, he just wants to beat the player using his right foot, and he'll have to improve that for sure. I feel another very positive thing for him, kind of that I've noticed, is his vision. That oftentimes he just looks up for the pass, especially when someone runs into a channel or like into an area of space that is wide open. Tries to pick him out in behind the defense, which is a very good asset to have when you consider that the fact that he's an 18-year-old player. Like, he's not supposed, well, not that he's not supposed to, but he's 18-year-old players are focused so much on giving like the right impression a lot of the time, that you're not considering the fact that he should be spraying those passes around, like whether it's to the flanks or, as I said, in behind the defense for the striker to get lash up onto. And those are all good things that kind of set him out, and I think that's why kind of he's all this completed package, that he's made the jump so quick to senior football. Yes, he still needs time to develop. That's absolutely true, but the jump that he's made is impressive because of said package that he has in terms of ability, skill, and sometimes taking the correct decision instead of just being a hot-headed youngster who tries to do his best without actually thinking what that best is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think he plays football quite simply, to be honest with you.
Yeah,
I think I think you're right to touch on the fact that he's very right-footed, but where he doesn't use all these tricks and flicks, he uses body feints to be able to buy time if he is in crowded areas. But a lot of the time when you find him on that left wing, he's so quick, and Gremio like to play in transition. I will stick up for him with his left foot. Sometimes with his assists, he knows where, if he travels with the ball or picks up and his teammate has found him in that space, his runs are often timed to perfection when the right back's out of position. If you look at his goal, his assist against Estudiantes in the Copa Libertadores, he's transitioned so well down that left-hand side, 2 or 3 touches, invited the fullback in, knocked it onto his left, just trusts him to beat him on pace, and then found Nathan Fernandez unmarked in the box. And he's almost made that, yes, he only has 4 or 5 assists, but he's made that into quite a trademark of his. So his delivery, his weight of pass, whether he is getting to the byline or chipping it in, has been way above his age. And I think this is why Brentford have recognised that and have snapped him up now, because as we know, if you sit on a South American talent for a further 3 to 6 months, then other teams come knocking and you have to be quick. You could look at that 40 appearances, like I said, the 7 goals, 4 assists, 10 million. Is he quite the superstar we're making him out to be? But just to add a little bit more context, which I forgot at the beginning of the podcast, is for those who don't know or haven't been taking close attention to sort of Brazilian football, or placing, closer attention to Brazilian football, Gremio were one of 3 sides affected by the floods in south of Brazil. Training ground, stadium flooded, had to move out. So they've had to sell a lot of players, haven't got a lot of money. So Potentially, look, if Nunes stayed around for another 6 months, that fee would have been double, but that's good money for Gremio right now. And having just been knocked out of the Libertadores, like they can't say no to players probably wanting to move, and 10 million is a lot of money considering what has unfortunately happened for them over the last 6 months. But if we touch again on the Libertadores, one of Nunes's almost final touches for Gremio was a goal. And I think the way in which you said he likes to, his trademark for in terms of his assists. Yes, he likes to beat his man down the left, very direct, cross it in. Most of his goals have been cutting inside and looking for that far corner. But I've noticed in the last 6 to 8 weeks how he's almost began to drift into the middle when the ball's on the right hand side, which shows a level of intelligence to come inside and look to finish off the move, not just stay out wide and be like, well, my responsibility is out here. The other winger has to do that. And then it's up to the striker. He's very much like gone, no, I want to adapt my game here. How can I best help out my teammates? And we're spotting him in more central areas or inside the box when his team are progressing in the final third, which to me is just another tick. More signs of his intelligence. Again, you've already touched upon it for his age. Like, it's brilliant to see. And like you said, 6 to 8 months now in senior football. If you were tuning into a Gremio game, you would think he'd had at least a season behind him to blow the cobwebs off. But overall, I think it's just one of those players who backs it up statistically as well. If we dive into the data, dribbles completed, he's the second best in the league, bearing in mind he's been averaging 60 minutes or coming off the bench at times into difficult games. And Gremio haven't been performing all that well because of the reasons we've listed about the flooding, etc., and losing key players. But he's only behind Wesley, who's another direct player. But where Brentford fans can potentially get excited is that it's more than Esteval and different profiles. And I'm not comparing Nunes to Esteval. I think Esteval long term, we've spoken about how good his ceiling is. But you can't ignore the fact that, and the data supporting Nunes when he's on the ball and his completed dribbling rate just goes to show how effective he is. He knows when he can beat a man, glide past them. He knows when to release the ball. I think we spoke off the podcast or on the previous one about that he probably needs to be thrown in the gym to 6 to 12 months. And people always say, oh, are these South Americans going to adapt to like the pace of the Premier League and like the strength he'll need and required? But there's so many sort of young wingers in the Premier League now. I always go back to like Brennan Johnson at Forest. Like, he had an incredible season in his first year and no one questioned his sort of physique because of him being British. It's just this thing we have around South American players. But for me, it's more about his mentality rather than his size. And if he shows good signs of what to do on the ball and where on the pitch and his movement, for me, that is what will make or break a player in Europe. Peter, before we dive into his Brentford fit, is there anything else you wanted to add around his profile?
Yeah, I was just going to mention the fact that, as well, apologies, as well as all the things that we've already mentioned, I feel like a little bit of a knock on him and probably a plus as well is what I would mention is that, number one, for me, I think oftentimes he kind of gets disencouraged from taking clear-cut shots. And I've seen him beat a man, get into a shooting position, and probably because then kind of the youthfulness kicks in. He just doesn't want to risk making an incorrect decision, which is sometimes good, sometimes bad. He doesn't actually shoot. He tries to either sidestep or play someone else in. And he's had, like, if he increases the shot volume on him, I definitely suspect that he's having another, say, 2-3 goals and 1 or 2 more assists, because it's very likely, say, deflections, everything happens in football. A lot of times people say, like, shoot and just let it not end up a counterattack. But as well as that, I feel one of the good things that he has is when he beats his man, a lot of times he shields the ball very correctly. And that's one thing that you definitely need, because at the end of the day, if you shield the ball correctly in a very dangerous area, you're very likely to draw foul, because by the time you've shielded the ball in front of the defender, he's very likely to make contact with you, which will be illegal because he's behind the back. He can't hit anything but your foot or your lower back area, and then obviously you've already gone down. Or he's just in a situation where the defender can't afford to foul him, be it because it's a penalty or a dangerous area or whatnot, and he now has the space to actually attack like very, very dangerous area of the penalty area. Sorry for using area 1,000 times. But those are things that I kind of, not that you don't teach, you teach them, but at 18, there's all this, as I mentioned, all this package that is there to just work upon. And I feel that kind of ties into the next point that how is Brentford fit? I actually feel the Brentford fit is one that it's very impressive, is very good, and why I feel he's well, not a match made in heaven because you never know, but I feel it's a great pickup from Brentford themselves, and over the course of recent years and from League One to now to the Premier League, they've kind of had a very phenomenal analytical department actually. So I'm not really surprised that they've kind of picked this one out and done it so quickly. It's one that because of said package, I feel someone like Thomas Frank and just every coach there will work with something and they see what can be he can be honed into. I feel in an odd way, and if I have to just throw a similarity here in a sense, I'd probably say Angelo a couple of years ago when he was first bursting at Santos was one that was a similar level talent and he was already making waves in Brazil but kind of stalled his move. And if he had then signed for Brentford, I'd applaud it in a similar way, for example. He's one that he has the package, he has everything in terms of the raw talent at hand. And the best thing about it is he doesn't have to necessarily play from the minute he arrives. He can take time because to me, he needs time to develop. That's absolutely 1000% certain. You mentioned the physique, that's one thing, but I feel there's still areas of his game. The fact that he can't still last 90 minutes is one that you just know you can kind of give it to the fact that he has to grow into his body, grow into kind of the energy levels that need to be, and especially at Prem level, the jump from Brazil to Premier League is in terms of pressure, I suspect he'll handle it, but in terms of actual fitness, stamina, and tempo of the game,
Mm.
is where he'll need adjustment. And one that I'm happy he's gone to Brentford because, yes, probably looking at it on the paper side of things, Yuan Wisa is the only one, or Visa, I don't know how to mention his name, but is one that is the only like pure left wing at the club that is likely set apart from the other backup options. But he can also play on the right, which gives a chance for Gustavo if he manages to hit the ground running and start quickly impressing, then maybe he can churn out a starting spot. And if not, he just doesn't need to perform immediately because they have other left wingers at the club. They can give him time to like grow into the Prem, get minutes here, get minutes there. It's one that won't be the rush that happened at Crystal Palace with Mateus França, with which
Yeah,
I still
that's a good
feel
point.
that
Yeah.
that's one where a lot of people will look like and say, "Oh, he was never ready for the Prem," and I'm like, "No, he was. He was just never a regular starter. So you needed to be careful with him, and you gave him to Roy Hodgson, who, I mean, he rushed Michael Olise twice. Like, let's be real here, and that's Michael Olise. Like,
Yeah, and the thing is with Matthias Frankel, they didn't at the time. I know we're going off topic a little bit, but I think it's good for comparisons in terms of Matthias Frankel came across without knowing his best position, and he was getting sporadic minutes here and there. And where I will sort of stick up for Nunes is, yeah, he's not playing the full 90 minutes, and obviously he needs that. But Brazil's calendar is a match every 3 to 4 days, so you could argue that he's actually been managed rather well in those circumstances. And I
absolutely,
think you're right in terms of with Brentford, maybe going to a team like Brentford, he's going to go under the radar a little bit more. Like the magnifying glass isn't going to be completely on him, apart from if you are obviously a Brentford fan. But look at the names they've been bringing in this window in terms of Fabio Carvalho's come in, uh, Kevin Sade, who's been at the club now, but he's settling into that period as well. So like, it's not like he's coming in and he's expected to start and needs to, like you say, like get going from that first minute. I think there's good people to learn from, and what Nunes has really excelled at is the way in which he can transition up the pitch effectively and provide an assist or in and around the final third with good players going to be on his wavelength. Now, yes, Ivan Toney looks like he's on his way out, but in Wemo, Iga Thiago, who's coming in as well, he has people in the box who are exactly that, foxes in the box. And someone like Nunes, if he can grow into the Premier League, which, yes, it may take time at first, but young players around him, Thomas Frank, I think he's a good coach. And the fact that there's those key young players who he likes putting faith in youngsters, I think that's what I'm trying to say here. So there seems to be a strategy of having these young, raw attacking players on either flank to support solid strikers in Mbuemo and Thiago, who's coming in. So when he gets fit, obviously he's out injured at the moment. But yeah, look, it's not going to be instant, I don't think. But then as we say this, when Gustavo Nunes first came to the senior side and I started watching him, I thought, okay, he's going to get a few sporadic minutes here and there. But within a few games, he was a key part of the squad, whether he was getting 60 minutes or half an hour. And I think one of the last things I want to touch on about him is if he comes off the bench, he's not a player to sulk or not really have an impact on the game. Like his last game for the club was a goal at the Maracanã against Fluminense in the round of 16, and he drifted into the box. And yes, the ball almost fell to him, but he was in the right position and he was more than happy to play his part for the team, which I think is a really good sign coming across to the Premier League straight away, knowing that he's not going to be starting regularly, but building into the team 10, 15, 20 minutes here will prove invaluable for him over time. So I would say not to look at his statistics and get bogged down with that on Wikipedia from what he's delivered at Gremio and also potentially his first 12 months with Brentford rather, but in time, like I think it's, as I said to introduce the podcast, I think Gustavo Nunes is the most exciting winger in Brazil at the moment, and to get him for £10 million is an absolute snip. Whether that's taking advantage of Gremio's situation at the moment and the fact that they need to sell, but for me, when Wesley at Corinthians being listed for 25 million, and then you can pick up Nunes for 10 million, it's just a no-brainer. And like the more we talk about it and the research we've done around Brentford as to the fit under Thomas Frank, it makes a lot of sense. And I just really like that there is no pressure on him to succeed straight away with the amount of options Brentford do have. And again, you mentioned the analytical team and their transfers have been pretty much spot on ever since coming back to the Premier League. So it ticks a lot of boxes. The data backs it up in terms of his dribbles complete rate, which we spoke about, and the fact that he's direct and those timely runs into the box. I think that's what you need to succeed in a Premier League. He's not this fancy showman. And I think that's exactly what is going to sort of stand him in good stead. So, Peter, anything to close off with?
Yeah, I was just going to add a little bit on Thomas Frank that I actually think the mere fact that kind of the 4-3-3 fit that like Gustavo's walking into, and the fact that Thomas
Yes.
Frank is
Yeah.
one of those coaches that actually, first of all, like the formation kind of similarities, obviously, because Gremio play 4-3-3 as well, that's obvious. But I feel the one thing about Thomas Frank is he's one of those man managers that just seems to kind of, yes, he expects the maximum of you when you're on the pitch, but he's one of those that can elevate you from a personal standpoint, and that's key for a young player coming in from a different like continent and obviously having to adjust to it and so on and so on and settle into a completely new environment now, because London is London at the end of the day. Let's not forget, especially when you're a 18 to 19-year-old young Brazilian. But the best thing about it is I feel with Tony now potentially out the door, and the fact that mentioned Wisa can move on the right wing, Buemo you mentioned, yes, Thiago's injured, and so on. There's room for him to not start, but there's also room for him to potentially edge out a starting piece. I feel that Brentford would likely once again be a more transition-heavy side, and you alluded to it at the start for Gremio, and that's the best thing about it, that he's actually not going to come in, especially when coming off the bench. I don't expect, say, Brentford to be playing Liverpool or Arsenal away or even at home in the 65th minute when, say, Gustavo gets like 25 minutes just to like make an impression, and for them to be absolutely bombarding them with attacks and him struggling to break down a deep block, for example. I suspect he's going to have to run into space, and if that's the thing that he has to do, by all means he'll probably do it. As well as the fact that you mentioned about the work rate, I think that's one of the underrated parts that we didn't mention actually, because as a young player in Renato Gaucho's system, the one way you're going to stay in that system, because Renato's not known for playing youth players unless forced to, is by them working hard. And he does work hard off the ball. It might not be, I don't know, Bernardo Silva levels of working hard off the ball, but it's still working hard off the ball. And that's one thing that Thomas Frank will value a lot. And this is why I feel that it's a very good match. Like, this is why I applaud good analytical teams and good scouting, because it's one that you look at the fit, and yes, you know that you're going to have to develop this player. Like, that's obvious. Like, it's very obvious. But you know that with time, you have a player that will absolutely match your system pound for pound, and it's a no-brainer. Like, the fee makes it like a good opportunity. Yes, you're not going to force him into the side immediately, but you're not paying too much for him. If you have the money and the fit is there, by all means do it. So I'm really excited about it, because it's one that takes a little load off him mentally, physically as well. He'll get time to settle in, and I'm hoping to see more of him over the course of the Premier League because let's face it, we're going to all watch him probably one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And to sign off, because we probably should have mentioned this and you touched on it there, but the fact that Brentford play a 4-3-3, and that's what he's been doing perfectly well at Gremio in that 4-3-3, and having, yes, obviously there's all the culture changes off the pitch, which we always speak about with these players. I think it's common sense now in terms of like them having to adapt to a completely new environment, new language, etc. But if he's in a similar formation to what he's been thriving at with Gremio at Brentford, it just makes that transition a little bit easier, and having that space to exploit in and around that left wing area is his bread and butter, and he's done it superbly well. We'll park it there for now. Peter, thanks very much for joining me. This is the third player analysis piece we've done in the last week on a series or flood of South American players moving across to Europe at the moment. So if there are any more, of course, we will cover them. Do subscribe across YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen or watch us. We massively appreciate it. Until next time, take care.